So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant from the Aramaic English translation of the word. The Aramaic or Hebraic scriptures are from the original manuscripts given by the Creator Yahweh Himself. He is the author of the heavens and the earth, and He is eternal. He has then His understanding, He has His way of writing, and He taught His people His holy precepts and judgments. These days where there is so much knowledge in the world, it's extremely important to understand the simplicity of the ways of Yahweh. His ways are extremely simple and takes the understanding from the layerings coming from the covenant, then the prophets, and the writings, and then obviously you understand then the renewed covenant in the future, and then the closing of the age, namely the autumn feast. Because we are then in the midst of an area from the time of the ascension of Yahweh, because He came in person. Try to understand this fact. The holy instructions given by Moses, those were holy instructions only a person from the instructions could do what the instructions were demanding. And there is only a person, Yahweh Himself. He instituted Himself and He came in person to do what He said He would do. The situation is many people don't understand Yahweh Himself came and He completed the first half of it. For some reason, people they think of this other person that came in His stead. As we understand, the Torah is divided in a couple of main sections. But this division has to do with the prophetic layers. So then we understand the prophecies. Try to understand, when we speak of a separation of the Torah, it's not the separation of the understandings. It's a mere understanding of prophetic related with Earth's time. When you begin to understand Earth's time, or the level of where we are at in the earth, we are bound by time. So the Creator had to come up with an understanding that it would bring it from His holy level, would go down to our level, where time then is also counted. As a whole, the Torah is not related with time. However, humans, they are bound by time. And the only way you can make this distinction is via the feasts. Try to understand the feasts. The spring feast and the autumn feast. Part of the year's understanding came via the spring feast. Part of it came autumn feast. You know, the harvest, Bikurim, Shavuot, and then autumn feast would be then the feast of the shofars. So when we begin to understand time in the Torah, because time is a foreign element, try to understand. Divinely speaking, time is a foreign element. But then the only way humans can understand is by time. Via the time we understand where the prophetic is at. And the only section you find time in Torah are the feasts. Each time of the year, they would then be part of a feast. Those were mainly divided in spring feast and autumn feast. couple of sections, couple of areas. Then you can introduce time. The problem this world is people, they were always deceived and lied to, and then they begin to understand, they scoundrelize the scripture, and they don't understand the spring and the autumn feasts. They are ignorant. And then if you ask any person these days, when is Yahweh returning? They say, any moment. It shows your ignorance. There is only a time where then the Messiah, Yahweh himself, returns. It is in autumn. That's why we have the autumn feast. So then when you begin to understand autumn feast and his return, then you begin to understand time in the midst of prophecies. But then a lot of people, they don't understand that the Torah is active. Then it is precisely what the Messiah said, the blind guiding the blind. So we are then preparing ourselves for the autumn feast. We don't know when it's going to take place. But we do understand that we are living in a time where then the first 1,000, where his people would be in charge of the spiritual understandings of heaven in their holy camps. They were then 1,000 years from his ascension up to the destruction of the tomb, from where Yahweh himself came out of. Then the other 1,000 years was in the time of the seed. Then, if you do the calculation, the time of the seed should have ended in 2009. But then began a rapid understanding, and then the number of so many other ways of having knowledge increased so much. And then we are more aware of the spiritual understandings of the prophetic. However, there is another layer on top of the situation. From the first 1,000, the other 1,000, there is another layer from the time where then Yahweh spent with the Samaritans. He spent a couple of days with them, indicating then the center of the 23rd chapter of Leviticus. Each day 1,000, couple thousand. When was the year that he spent time with the Samaritans? Around 4031 and a half, because he was born in 3999. How do they know? They reversed the time and then the lunar view of every month, and the computer was able to calculate based upon the astronomical observations of the time, namely starting as a reference point of the huge star that came up. And then we begin to understand that his time of showing himself into the world then was at hand. Astronomical observations, plus the history of the time. Then 41, no, 3999, 40, 31, somewhere around that time, 40, 31 and a half, 4130. Was it 4130? No, 4031. Because of 3999 plus another 32 years. So then you have a couple thousand years from this time, leaves us at 60, 31 and a half. But then we understand from Mitzvah, the first gospel, where then the Messiah said, but then at the end the time would be reduced for the sake of the elect. What does it mean? They would return to their services, because the second services of the Holy Tabernacles were then neglected for centuries. So prior of the starting of the vengeance, and the world never experienced vengeance before, then his people would return to their services. That's where then the time of deceit of the junky churches, then they're going to be eliminated, because it's a deceit. And then the holy camps are going to return, and they are going to become very popular, as they were popular during the time of Shaul the Shaliach. Then at a certain point, then vengeance is going to start. Then the holy prophets prophesy regarding of the end, such as Daniel, the statesperson, Yeshayahu, and the other prophets. Each of those lines, they must match harmoniously with the Torah until the closing of the age. So we are living in a time where then the first 1,000 is done, the second 1,000 is done, ended in 2009. But then you can't stop the time abruptly. You are not speaking of time, you're speaking of layers of prophecy. Do you understand? There is a time of transition. Did the people understand the first and the second services? No, it had to take around 100 years for them to get the second service in motion. There was a transitional time. So then we are living a transitional time. We are in 6 to 12 per their calendar of the Creator. So then you begin to understand what's going on then. The first 1,000 was done, the second 1,000 where Satan would be in reign. And then Nehashtan would be then in charge for 1,000 years. What does it mean? It's a deceit. It's the time of deceit. It's the time where then the people, rather than understanding the second services of the Holy Tabernacles, they would believe a Messiah, they would be outside of the Holy Tabernacles. Thus, the time of deceit. Then Satan did rule for 1,000 years, since 1009. If you do a study, when was the most of the churches then began to spring up? After 1009. Huge number of churches came because it was a time of deceit. Ended in 2009. But there is another layer of the prophecy from the time he spent with the Samaritans, indicating Leviticus 23rd, chapter 22nd verse. The entire understanding of the 23rd chapter of Leviticus in the 22nd verse gives you the entire Megillah, or then the writings of Ruth, being a foreigner. Ruth was a foreigner, but she was granted a position in the land during her time. And then afterwards comes the autumn feast, the second half of the Torah and the prophets and the writings. That's how you read time in Scripture. That's how Yahweh decided to have time mixed with prophecies. But then unfortunately, a lot of the people having the Greco-Roman translation, they can't understand. They don't have the capacity of understanding. So we are then preparing ourselves. We are going to watch then the people of Israel, those people that are going to be saved, meaning they are going to start understanding the work of Yahweh as in a facet of the sun. Never away from the understanding of the time of Moses. The services of the tabernacle continued. But there was another facet of Yahweh they did not understand. You know, the time where then his people, Yahweh would open their eyes at the end, they would understand a facet of Yahweh they did not understand. They would continue doing the services in the holy tabernacles. But then the tabernacles became portable. They would not sacrifice anymore, but they would receive directly information from heaven on a continuous basis. And then the world would be prepared for the vengeance to come. Thus you begin to understand it then when Yohanan, at the very end, around 100s, he was then having the third role. So then he was indicating the people in the very future that there is a vengeance coming. He was pointing to the second half of Leviticus, where you understand time and prophecy. Thus the shadow of the events to come. But then if you don't understand that the Torah is active, how are you going to understand? So when we understand and push for the camps, each camp having a holy tabernacle in them, then we begin to understand the plan of salvation granted to the Gentiles. So they started the service being secluded. In the desert, they should have remained secured and also secluded. But during the time the Messiah came, Yahweh himself came in person, the nation was not secluded. They were mixed. And then they got mixed up. But the Messiah continued on. There was then the second service. And a lot of then the people from Israel, they went behind. They went behind the clock. They got stuck in the first service without a temple yet. But then, the blind area of them, obviously this time, they are going to begin to understand what Yahweh was doing. So then we are preparing ourselves for the autumn feast. So the whole teaching they received and trained for more than 1,000 years, they are going to be part of it. So then Israel ended up by not being secluded as they were told to do. Then they had themselves being stuck in a level of the divine without introducing time. They were not able to understand time and prophecy. That's where they lost a track. So they are waiting for the Messiah to come. Most of them are yet, because they don't understand time in the Scripture. And they were very much trained in the day of the sounding of the trumpet, as we know as trumpet. But the truth of it, it's a shofar. The sounding of the shofar, it is in a day and an hour that nobody knows, because it depends upon the time and also the lunar view of the time. That's why nobody knows, because it has to do with the way Yahweh has decided then to have the stars and the sun and the lunar view as understanding of time. That's why we have a feast related with time. Then you understand the prophetic. Please stay tuned, much more coming up. Because then the autumn feast, then we have the record we begin to explore based upon this prophetic and time. So then we can line up ourselves with understanding from the Creator. Then we understand where we are heading towards. Because no person is going to heaven. It was made it up. Then we are going to explore why so many people were deceived. This scoundrelized scripture is an absolute debauchery. How people were so mesmerized and they never had a clue what they were reading.